Namaste. Namaste. Right, so you probably worked out I'm still in the Indian Himalayas, learning more yoga and meditation. And today's video really is about the new format of the videos that I've decided to do. And well, I'm going to do two types of videos from now on. I'm going to keep doing the sweaty gorilla interviews with people who I kind of align with from a health perspective. And I'm also going to do the second series of videos, which are going to be a series on fearlessness, mitochondria, gold and God, which I really enjoyed doing last week. And they're all going to have the goal, well, the second series, the mitochondrial ones, the goal of those is really to discuss what I think is the convergence of science and spirituality. And these new videos, the mitochondrial ones, we'll start off with some interesting quotes on fearlessness from all spiritual literature, because pretty much doesn't matter which spiritual literature you look at, fearlessness is the first value or attribute which is suggested we develop as humans. So start off with a couple of quotes about fearlessness, then we'll go into 5 separate chapters, and those chapters are going to be on mitochondrial science, mitochondrial research, some interesting science on gold and some news on gold, and then finally about altered states of consciousness, particularly the flow state and the 7 layers of consciousness. You'll see that spirituality is full of ways of using the flow state to access the 4th state of consciousness and ultimately the 7th state of consciousness. And that's what we're going to be talking about a lot in these videos, because it's what I've been doing a lot of in the Indian Himalayas, which is kind of the birthplace for some of the understanding of these concepts. So the first quote on fearlessness comes from the Vedantic literature, which says that the first character trait we should develop is fearlessness, that fear has no contribution to make in a moral life, and all moral life should be based on fearlessness. The second quote comes from the Bible about fearlessness, which is from Isaiah. The quote goes, "Do not fear, because I am with you." All right, let's move on to chapter 1, which is mitochondrial science. Now I'm going to go right back to the start of this, and if any of you have decided to follow these videos, which I think personally is a good idea, because I think it's going to blow your mind, some of the things we talk about. That's not the Ganges. I'm in the foothills of the Himalayas above Rishikesh, and that river comes from the hills around Rishikesh and flows a few kilometres downriver into the Ganges, but I'm above the Ganges at the moment. So let's start off with mitochondrial science. Don't worry, I'm still going to make videos on how I like growing and eating pomegranate, but I'm going to integrate that information into this format, because as we know, ultimately most of the foods that we eat interact with our mitochondria, which is the final step in the pathway of health. So, as I said, you might want to write down a couple of these facts, because we're going to be referring to them throughout this whole series. So, let's start from the beginning. Science says that the universe is about 15 billion years old. We're aware of one universe. There's some theories now that there may be a lot more universes, and we're calling it the multiverse. But at the moment, let's stick to what we know, which is there is one universe that's 15 billion years old. And that universe is made up of 2 trillion different galaxies, of which our solar system is one of those galaxies. So there's 2 trillion observable galaxies, and there's thought to be anywhere between 100 billion and a trillion planets in our galaxy. So that makes a lot of planets in the universe, and there may be trillions of universes, which adds up to about an estimated 300 quintillion planets in the universe. I have no idea how many that is, but it sounds like a lot. I'm very happy with the planet we're on. Right, next fact is our universe is thought to be 15 billion years old, and our universe is thought to have started from what's called a singularity. And a singularity is said to be a tiny point of extreme heat and energy. There's no explanation where the singularity comes from, but there you go. Then one day, 15 billion years ago, that singularity decides to explode. No real explanation why this tiny singularity, which is way smaller than an atom, decides to explode, but it does. And that when that singularity explodes, forms into a bunch of protons and neutrons and gets scattered throughout the universe, and eventually these protons and neutrons coalesce into atoms, the first ones thought to being hydrogen and helium. So that all happens 15 billion years ago. This nothingness of a singularity, energy and heat, suddenly explodes, forms into atoms after a while, and these atoms then coalesce and form some elements, particularly hydrogen and helium. Then, eventually, those scattered atoms coalesce and form into all the planets in the universe. So that timeline's very interesting to remember. The other thing really interesting to remember that you'll find useful as we go through these videos is the 5 things that mitochondria make. In fact, I've recently changed that to 6, which I'll explain in a second. So I have been saying that mitochondria produce 5 things. Hello! That was energy in the form of ATP, water, free radicals, light, and heat. I'm now going to add a 6th, which is an electromagnetic frequency, because I think that's relevant to communication with our environment. And it's really interesting because the scientific literature, hello, namaste, has been full of this recently because of the recent evidence that, well, not evidence, well, yeah, the recent proof that our bodies emanate light, which we've been talking about for a while as biophotons, but that light starts at the time of conception and then finishes, it extinguishes itself when we die. Now that's easy to research on the internet. You can just Google that and you'll find the images of the mice where they've shown them emanating light. And the light, of course, comes from mitochondria in the form of biophotons. And it's interesting that we also discussed recently how light starts at the time of conception. And the interesting evidence that we're not random, namaste, we're not random selections, that the egg specifically chooses a sperm, lets lots of sperm go past before it decides on the one that it wants. And as soon as conception occurs, when the sperm enters the egg, there's a flash of light, which is called the zinc spark, which is thought to occur because zinc suddenly gets expressed out of the conception through microtubules. I was going to bring a capsule of zinc with me and I forgot. Well, actually it wasn't a capsule of zinc because I don't take zinc, I eat oysters. It was a capsule of magnesium, which I do take, and put it in my palm. I could probably walk around for a long time though if that was a capsule of zinc before it decided to explode into flames. Because usually you need some sort of spark to cause something to ignite into light or fire. So quite interesting from my perspective, the convergence of science and spirituality. The conception begins with a flash of light, and our time on the earthly planet finishes when that light goes out. All right, So that's what we need to remember for the ongoing discussion on mitochondrial science. Next, I want to go to chapter 2, which is the new information on mitochondrial research. And this was fascinating research which just came out this week on dementia diseases in mice. I'll put the screenshot of the study at the end of the video if you want to have a look. And what these researchers did is they used a mouse model of dementia and they added receptors to the surface of the mitochondria in the brain of the mice, which allowed increased production of ATP from the mitochondria in the brain, which improved dramatically the mice memory symptoms. And the conclusion was, from the study, nothing to do with me. I don't give advice, remember. I just talk about what I'm interested in while I'm walking around the Himalayas. But they thought that that was a good evidence that the dementia illnesses are caused by energy failure in the mitochondria of the brain. In fact, they ended the study by saying this was the first evidence that established a cause and effect relationship between mitochondrial dysfunction and neurodegenerative diseases. Right, chapter 3, gold. Well, the gold news is that the BRICS nations, which started off as 5, and now 10, with a long list of countries wanting to join them. So we've got, originally we had Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now there's been added Egypt, Indonesia, and the United Arab Emirates. And the central banks of those countries have been accumulating gold like crazy, basically accelerated when the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, America decided to confiscate some of the Russian country's gold savings from their central banks and donate them to Ukraine, which is kind of a precedent of raiding another country's savings. So it started this mad rush of countries in the BRICS nations. They've been accumulating gold like crazy, and in fact a lot of countries, UK, Canada, their central banks vaults are empty basically. A lot of their gold was sold because there's no doubt that the world is heading to some sort of monetary change, because the printing of unlimited paper money, well, it's not even paper money anymore, it's electronic money by the press of a button on a computer, is causing massive inflation, because inflation's not really defined as prices going up, but it's defined as increasing monetary supply. I just find it really interesting that a money that's been used for 3,000 years still, despite everything, retains its usefulness as a monetary system. And remember, we discussed that the important characteristic, not according to me, I know nothing about finances, I'm just reading the literature. According to the experts, the number one cardinal property of money is not that it's rare. There's plenty of things which are rarer than gold, but it's hard to produce. It's hard to add to the existing supply, which is why gold and Bitcoin probably the hardest, quote, money in the world, because that's embedded in software, and some other cryptocurrencies with what we called last time as a limited and diminishing supply may be going to be used in the new monetary system. Okay, I don't know what chapter we're up to. Something about the science of gold. Now, the really interesting thing, and this is relevant when we talk about how easy it is to get more gold, is that gold, the science says, was formed originally when two neutron stars collided. which form gold, and then that giant pile of gold dust was disseminated out into the universe and helped form some of the planets. And on Earth, most of that gold, I think the figures are 98%, 99% of the gold on Earth is part of the molten core of the planet, and only a very small amount is in the mantle and the crust of the planet, which therefore does make kind of gold quite hard to increase its supply. I think we said last week that it goes up by 1.7% a year. It's only 1-2% of the Earth's gold is in the crust or the mantle. Now that is slowly, interestingly, rising to the surface and can come to the surface through volcanic eruptions. But most of it's in the molten core of the Earth. Pretty hard to send people down there to grab some gold. Okay, final chapter. And I'm going to be adding to these chapters every week. They're all going to come together by the time we get to this end of the series. So this chapter's about the flow state. And what I've been doing a lot of work over here with on the flow state is the flow state, which is defined as a mental state where you're completely absorbed and focused on an activity such that you lose all sense of time and self-consciousness. Now, we've all experienced that at some stage. And as we talked about last week, Brad Pitt in the F1 movie was a perfect example of that when he won the race after entering the flow state. I think everybody's watched that movie, found that scene pretty extraordinary, because everybody's felt it at one stage or other. I felt it once in a basketball game. I felt it once with a kiss. Doesn't happen very often, but the whole idea of meditation and plant medicine, I think plant medicine is an early state of development of these levels of consciousness. But the whole idea about particularly yoga and meditation is using techniques to enter the flow state, which then help you enter the fourth state of consciousness, and ultimately the seventh state of unity consciousness. All right, that's enough from me. My new plans for the video, 2 series of videos. One on the Sweaty Gorilla videos, where I talk to people on the same path as me in terms of health and fitness. The second one on mitochondria, gold and God. And we've discussed the chapters we're going to be talking about, which will be some quotes about fearlessness from the spiritual literature. And we're talking about mitochondrial science, mitochondrial research, gold science, gold news, and my work on the flow state and the different level of consciousness. And then we're going to try and put it all together over time as the general theme of these videos, which is the convergence of science and spirituality. As you can see, the roads are a giant mess here, and it's just easier for me to do the videos walking on the roads at the moment. After this video, I'm going up to a temple high up in the Himalayas where there's a great view of the mountains. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm off to try and find this temple. Always remember, doesn't matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you are never out of the fight. Don't give up. Peace and love from me. Namaste. See you next week from the extraordinary, under repair from the monsoons, the Indian Himalayas. Bye. And remember that after nearly 6 years, I remain suspended in nutritional environmental medicine and can only work as an emergency specialist in a public hospital. So none of this is health or medical advice, and certainly does not replace a professional relationship with your own healthcare provider. And just because I go jumping in freezing cold water doesn't mean anybody else should without adequate training in the hormetic principles of contrast therapy.
Let's see the world together. Let's try to see it all.